Hey guys, Noel here, and it's Tuesday, and I wanted to do a quick video for the philosophy and theology weblog section. And I've been on a bit of a John Baudrillard kick recently, so I thought we would talk a little bit about the idea of, is hyperreality all bad? Now, hyperreality is just John Baudrillard's argument that American hegemony and capitalist mass culture has led to a world where language and thought and image have all been taken over by simulation and signs that no longer represent anything. So essentially what that means is that I used this example in a previous video. I was watching a commercial for Law and Order. It was the syndicated version of Law and Order. And the commercial said, Law and Order is so real, it'll take your breath away. So what does reality mean in that commercial? Like reality, like the concept of this is the real world. Reality has now been flattened to basically sell products. And what is the product that reality here is trying to sell? It's Law and Order. What is Law and Order? It's a show that claims to be real, but is it real? No, it's not. It's an actor, it's a cop TV show. Well, what is it about that cop TV show that makes it claim that it's real, even though everyone knows that it's fake? Well, it's supposed to be based on headlines. But what are headlines? You know, headlines are sensationalized versions of reality designed to get you to buy newspapers, right? And so those are at least three steps that are pretty radically removed from the actual event of the crime that's taking place. And so there's an example right there of hyperreality in culture and action, right? Now, the interesting thing, though, about Baudrillard, and I'm going to borrow something from Rick Roderick, the teaching company philosopher from Duke, is that I think that while Jean Baudrillard, because of the philosophical tradition that he comes from, which is to speak in very radical, apocalyptic, hyperbolic terms, so you have people like Michel Foucault, who's another, deceased famous French sociologist and philosopher, saying things like, the world is a jail. Which isn't true. I mean, in some countries maybe, but, in Foucault points out really powerful things about the power structures in so-called enlightened societies, but he uses the hyperbole that it's a jail, and if you actually compare life in a jail versus, the life of a French intellectual who's worshipped by his students, it's not the same thing, right? Okay, so there's a good deal of hyperbole in the tradition that Jean Baudrillard comes from. So the hyperbole comes in the sense that Baudrillard just acts like reality is dead. But what Rick Roderick pointed out, and I think this is true, is that if you read Baudrillard with the idea that Baudrillard is describing a process toward the destruction of reality, then I think and you find real world examples that back up his argument, then I think that Baudrillard might make a little more sense. Now, maybe, in Baudrillard's own head, and, who knows, maybe he could even be right, maybe reality doesn't exist, but I'm going to make an argument right now that's going to say that we're on the direction toward hyperreality more, and we live with degrees of hyperreality, but we're not yet in a world where technology has completely destroyed humanity. Even though I think that's what Baudrillard thinks. And I think also the fact that, a lot of French intellectuals, of the Marxist tradition, although Baudrillard's not a Marxist anymore, because he's dead. Even before he was dead, he stopped being a Marxist. But, the idea that in 1968, the student uprising in France, didn't lead to France becoming a radical socialist, Marxist country, that disappointed a lot of thinkers, and especially then once the Soviet Union proved itself not to be communist in the idealistic sense of the word that Karl Marx described in the manifesto, then I think a lot of thinkers like Baudrillard was kind of like, all right, well, America won, and this confirms my ideas, so it's kind of like it's the end of the world, so let's talk about everything as if it's the end of the world. And I think you could argue that that's pretty immature, but nevertheless, I do think that there is a good, there are some strong elements in Baudrillard's argument. But let's make a quick argument as to why there's still some reality left. So in Terminator Genesis, toward the end of the movie, it's one of the newer Terminator movies. Christian Bale fights a computer-generated image of Arnold Schwarzenegger that, in the movie, is supposed to be the 1984 Arnold Schwarzenegger. And it looks just like the 1984 Arnold Schwarzenegger. So if you didn't know... In fact, my friend's dad thought that was Arnold Schwarzenegger, right? He didn't... He's like, "Whoa, Arnold looks really good." And then my friend went to him, like, "That's not real. That's a computer image of Arnold," right? So that is... Within that very specific example, that's hyper-reality in action, right? But to show that there's still some reality left, I know, and my friend knows that that's not really Arnold Schwarzenegger, because Arnold Schwarzenegger is now an old retired governor of California, who's hosting a fake reality TV show that our, hyper real president used to host, right? So Donald Trump Arnold Schwarzenegger may be filling in for Donald Trump. He may be a politician and an actor, which are extremely shallow things that produce very shallow thinking, but he's still got a beating heart and warm blood, and that's distinctly more human than that image of Arnold. And the fact that we can still distinguish those two, I think, shows that we're not living in a full-blown hyper-real destruction of reality yet. Now, to harken back to Rick Roderick again, Rick Roderick, he made a similar statement to kind of the one I just made, where he said that, hyper reality can't get by without injections of reality in it. So there has to be some things that are seen as real. And Rick Roderick talked about in his Baudrillard lecture that reality TV was a symptom of that. But I would argue, in fact, that reality TV is actually a farther step away from reality, and in fact is a more savage, manipulative attack on reality than... here's the example that Rick Roderick used. He's like, people get tired of hyper-idealized worlds like Kojak. And so now we have cops, where you have just a bunch of cops being cops, That... I think that Cops is actually a much less authentic show than Kojak. And you might argue, like, oh, well, here's, now I'm infected by hyper-reality, and I guess we all are. But here's the thing, is that reality TV is very nihilistic, right? Reality TV, if you look at it, and if you look at the development of reality TV and the content of a lot of reality TV, there's no ideals there, or there's very little. I mean, it might depend on the show that you watch. Right, there's some shows like, Fixer Upper with Chip and Joanna Gaines, where people build houses for people, and I think that's basically a parallel for the benevolence of American imperialism, building up things for, and improving things for backward, stupid people. But there's not the same level of idealism and hope in reality TV. Like, you watch a show like Real Housewives of whatever, or Survivor, or... just, pick a reality show. And it's just people existing as willful narcissists. And that's what you consume, right? And you're supposed to identify yourself with these willful narcissists making a spectacle out of their willful narcissism, all right? And to me, that's a kind of a base level of thinking and existence that's beneath what it means to be human, right? Like, Aristotle had these levels of like humanity, right? It's like there's like the vegetative, the animated, and the analytical, right? We're now going to the purely animated and semi-vegetative, right? Because there's not a whole lot of hope or anything in those shows other than just, this is authentic. Being a willful narcissist, right? Or just existing. Like, if you watch an episode of Cops, right? It's just, cops kind of selectively, things selectively filmed and put together to tell a story. Like, reality TV is not authentic. It's basically just unpaid actors following a script, right? But now I won't use Kojak as an example, because I think the one I'll use is going to be a little more powerful. But let's use an example like Columbo, right? Columbo is a scripted show with actors. It's a cop show. But within Columbo, I think there is something very real and very hopeful and very human in a positive analytical way. And that's that the everyman who understands that we don't live in a world that's beyond good and evil, or refuses to submit to a world that claims it's beyond good and evil, can take the corrupt elite that thinks it lives in a world beyond good and evil and bring them to justice, and bring them to justice in a way in which his humanity is constant and his intellect is constantly underestimated. But that ritual, or that, that show of, the last shall be first, kind of turned into a cop show, I would argue that has much more human aspiration and much more of a positive sense than just kind of smudging on with these, reality TV shows, which, like the Law and Order advertisement that I talked about at the start of the show, are far removed from reality, right? They're still scripted, they're still put together, they're still flattened corporate versions of reality sold to people for consumer purposes. Here's another thing that I want to talk about as far as is hyperreality that bad? There have been, commentators and, Baudrillard himself, Rick Roderick, they'll say things like, well, the family sitcom, that's not real. And they act if it's like some kind of banal, manifestation of American hegemony. Well, is it? If you're someone who doesn't have that middle class living standard, and it's not about being greedy. Let's say that you live in a house without hot water. Let's say that you live in a country where there's just not enough food for people to eat. Let's say if you live in a country with, massive shortages of things that people need to live comfortably, and then you see that image of, a happy, stable, harmonious, prosperous family, and you use that, even if you know that that's just, you should know that that's a symbol or an aspiration, but that symbol or that aspiration or that hope that is manifest in that image, that's, I would argue, Baudrillard talks about these, kind of like fractal humanity, or, elements of humanity that you can use as what he calls like a fatal strategy. Like, you're gonna die and, reality's dead, but here are some ways you can navigate and maintain some of your, some positive aspect to your doomed life, So that's the kind of comedic hyperbolic language that Baudrillard uses, but nevertheless, there is a good degree of pretension to people who look their nose down on these, family sitcoms or something like that, because it's like, oh, they're also happy, but it's also boring, Yeah, because you have that level of comfort. You're living in bourgeois ennui, right? I'm just so dissatisfied because I've got all my needs met, but it's something still lacking, right? That's your problem, right? That's not the image's problem. The image's problem has actually, even though it's a corporate flattened image designed to make society more stable, but what it also does is it makes people want to consume that image because people see their hopes for a better future, hopes for a better life, hopes for, happiness and human relationships and harmony reflected in that image. And in that sense, hyperreality is not that. That version of hyperreality is not a bad thing and can be used to make the world a better place, I would argue. And also I would argue that those hyperreal images have more, those images from like about 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago have more reality and humanity in them than where we've traveled right now, which is, and still a world that's really kind of saturated with, really amoral, just behavior where people feel like, the only meaning they have is whatever it is they want, So that's my video, guys. Until next time, my name is Noel. You take care. Bye-bye.